Created by some of the people responsible for the Dead Space trilogy and considered by many as the spiritual successor to the Dead Space games, there was, unsurprisingly, a huge amount of hype surrounding the Callisto Protocol prior to launch. Unfortunately, this hype came to an abrupt end when it released at the tail end of 2022. Its launch was marred by a slew of technical issues, and many felt that instead of innovating, the Callisto Protocol merely imitated. It also didn't help that the Dead Space and Resident Evil 4 remakes were just on the horizon, undoubtedly curtailing many potential sales. As a fan of the survival and action horror genre, and as a huge fan of the Dead Space trilogy, yes, even the third one, this was hugely disappointing for me. It was a huge disappointment for developer Striking Distance 2, with the game falling well short of its sales target. As a result, they would part ways with studio founder, CEO, and game director Glenn Schofield less than a year after the game's launch. The story doesn't end there though for the Callisto Protocol. Striking Distance spent the next 6 months trying to put things right by squashing bugs, fixing performance, improving frustrating gameplay systems, and adding new ways to play. On top of this, they shipped a story expansion in June of 2023. So the question is, have the various updates made this a better game? And ultimately, what's it like to play now? I sat down recently to find out. I also wanted to see for myself if the criticisms in those original reviews were accurate. Was this simply a mediocre and pale imitation of the games that inspired it, or was there something more to it than its impressive visuals? Rocky launches are unfortunately far too common in today's gaming landscape. Many games have redeemed themselves over months or even years of continual support, but this isn't a given, especially for non-ongoing single-player games like the Callisto Protocol. It's also heavily dependent on what the problems are. Fixing technical issues such as poor performance is relatively straightforward, but changing design decisions like how the combat works is less so. The Callisto Protocol suffered from both technical and design issues at launch. Now, there's quite a lot of detail in the patch notes, so I'm going to do my best to summarize these changes and discuss how they work in practice. One of the main concerns was poor performance, especially on PC. Performance was so bad that in many instances it was basically unplayable. The biggest issue was stuttering, sometimes dropping the frame rate into GoldenEye 64 territory. According to Digital Foundry, this was caused by an issue with shader compilation, and it didn't matter how powerful your hardware was, this problem was unavoidable. If Glenn Schofield is to be believed, this was caused by a clerical error, where an erroneous patch was accidentally uploaded, effectively breaking the game. The first update directly addresses the stuttering problem, and by most accounts it appears to have been fixed. Performance optimization would remain a key focus of the post-launch support though, and it was something the development team continued to work on right up until the final patch. It's worth keeping in mind that the frame rate on PC still seems to fluctuate quite a lot. It's not the juddery mess the game shipped in, and it's much more playable now, but it's still recommended to go for moderate graphics settings. Xbox and PlayStation had their fair share of technical gremlins too. Players on current-gen machines originally reported crashing and numerous frame rate drops, especially during combat. Additionally, Xbox Series X didn't have any ray trace reflections in the quality mode. This was a weird one because the PS5 did have them, and it was able to hit the 30 frames per second cap more consistently. Again, by and large, these issues appear to have been improved. Performance on current-gen systems is more consistent, especially on Xbox, and Series X has ray trace reflections in the quality mode. Finally, there's last gen. Considering that this game was originally planned as a next-gen exclusive, it came as no surprise that the last-gen ports were considerably stripped back. They have less detail, lower resolutions, lower quality assets, and a maximum frame rate of 30 frames per second. And it should go without saying that you can forget about ray tracing. All of this remains the same. None of the updates have made the game look better on the older hardware. Performance on these machines was also in a pretty bad state, and looking at the patch notes, there was only one last-gen specific update. This was for the PS4, and it fixed a crashing issue. There are a couple of updates that mention general performance optimization across all platforms. So, being an optimist, I think last-gen machines are likely to run better than they did at launch, although I wouldn't expect miracles here. Okay, so that covers performance. The other major grievance people had with the game at launch was the combat. The Callisto Protocol's focus on melee combat was seen as problematic because of the number of enemies you have to fight at once. This often resulted in you getting swarmed, receiving damage from enemies off-screen, and having limited control over which enemies you could target. The main focus, in regards to gameplay and the updates, seemed to be centered around improving the core experience, rather than overhauling it. Some of the key changes were speeding up animations, such as reload animations and healing, to improve how quickly you can react and give you a better chance of survival. They made adjustments to the camera to help you see incoming attacks better, and there were some fundamental changes to enemy behavior. You're less likely to be attacked by a second enemy while delivering a beatdown to the threat in front of you now. Getting attacked from behind is less frequent, and you also take less damage from off-screen attacks. There were a couple of quality of life improvements too, such as weapon swapping not getting interrupted if you dodge or get hit. Beyond these improvements, 3 new game modes were added to the base game. New Game Plus is exactly what it says on the tin. Kind of mind-blowing that a survival action horror game would ship without one, but hey, it's here now, and yes, they did finally add in the ability to skip cutscenes. This mode lets you start a new game with all the weapons, upgrades and credits you had at the end of your previous run. There are no new skins or cash rewards, unfortunately. Some kind of military skin akin to the Dead Space games would have been dope, but alas, there's nothing. Hardcore mode is again what it sounds like, a much harder version of the base game with fewer loot drops and more difficult enemies. It also has a New Game Plus, which unlocks when you finish the regular hardcore mode. Finally, there's Dismemberment mode. This is a weird one. It lets you more easily cut enemies into pieces, and that's kind of it. It's basically a new easy difficulty, and as such doesn't have any achievements or a New Game Plus. I guess if you want a super easy version of the game, this scratches that itch. Now, something that I've heard from a few sources is that the various updates, so performance, gameplay and content, have changed things so much so that it's almost like a completely different game now, and I gotta disagree. This is still fundamentally the same game, it's just a better, more refined version of the original experience. If you were put off by the melee combat or the types of enemies the game launched with, these updates haven't changed any of that. The only thing that comes close to providing that different game feeling is New Game Plus. I didn't bother with most of the guns in my first playthrough, so I focused on leveling them up in my second run. This kind of turned it into a third-person shooter. Melee combat still makes up a large part of the combat though, so it didn't make it feel like a different game entirely. Okay, so how does a better and more refined experience translate into what it's like to play? So, for transparency's sake, I didn't play it at launch. I've watched and read a ton of reviews, but I have no first-hand experience with the day one version, and as such, I can only talk about what the experience is like today. I played it on PS5 and chose the quality mode for my first playthrough, and the performance mode for my New Game Plus, and for the Final Transmission DLC. I did find the occasional graphical oddity and random dip in performance during combat. The performance issues were the most noticeable when playing in the performance mode, especially when playing the Final Transmission DLC, although it's nothing like the horrible mess described at launch. From a gameplay point of view, I encountered none of the frustrations described in those early reviews. Now, Jacob still moves like someone practicing Tai Chi after a few drinks, which makes the combat challenging. So you can't snap from one target to the next, or quickly sprint into a combo or ranged attack. Taking on multiple enemies should be avoided if possible, but the difficulty feels just about right. You're neither an unstoppable killing machine, nor do you need to rely on luck to make it through each encounter. You need to be strategic about which enemies to engage with, and how to neutralize threats as quickly as possible. Resource management comes into play quite a lot. Your inventory is pretty small, so you'll need to decide what to keep and what to discard. You'll also need to decide if you're going to focus on upgrading a couple of items, or try and thinly spread your resources across everything. On your first run, for example, I would strongly recommend spending your cash on the baton and the grip. Combat is simple, but you upgrade your abilities, obtain new gear, and encounter new enemy types frequently enough that it never feels repetitive. Now, I didn't see anywhere in the patch notes about them changing up the jump scare frequency, but I reckon they must have. I didn't come across nearly as many as the early reviews complained about, like the worm things in lockers. I think I saw 1 or 2 in my entire playthrough. I also want to call out the haptic feedback on PS5. Up until this point, I was convinced that haptics was just a gimmick. The Callisto Protocol has finally changed my mind. The way it's used to convey the weight and power of the baton is just one example that comes to mind. The only criticism from the early reviews that I felt was spot on are the stealth sections towards the end. Why other enemies don't react to the sound of you murdering their buddies is ridiculous, and taking out these enemies is like shooting fish in a barrel when you have this knowledge. Finally, something I'd like to highlight that only a handful of other reviews mentioned is the severely underrated podcast that acts as a prequel. The Callisto Protocol Helix Station is a 6-part story that follows a skip tracer and a group of soldiers hunting down an escaped criminal on a derelict space station. The voice talent and atmosphere is excellent, and while it does have some corny dialogue, it does a great job of building out the world, and it acts as the perfect appetizer to the game. Each episode is about 30 minutes long, so that's roughly 3 hours in total, making it bite-sized and easy to consume. If you can make the time, I would strongly recommend giving it a listen before playing the game. In addition to the free content added to the game, the Callisto Protocol got a few paid add-ons. The first was a new skin, giving you the armor worn by the Outer Way. Pretty underwhelming if you ask me, and for the $7.50 Australian price, this is probably the worst value piece of DLC. The second piece of DLC is the Contagion bundle. This one again includes a new skin and a bunch of new death animations. The main attraction here is a new permadeath mode called Contagion, for those who think the hardcore mode is for tourists. The third DLC pack is the Riot bundle, and it includes, you guessed it, a new skin and even more death animations. I feel like at least half of these animations should have been part of the main game. Locking them behind a paywall feels unnecessarily stingy. The meat of this pack is a new Horde mode called Riot. It's exactly what it sounds like, and it includes a new area to explore. If you like the Callisto Protocol's combat and Horde modes, this ain't bad, although it would have been better if it was multiplayer. The final piece of DLC is fittingly called Final Transmission. This 3 to 4 hour story expansion acts as the true ending, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute. All of these DLC packs can be purchased together with the Season Pass. Normally this is $42 Australian, which is only marginally cheaper than buying them separately. It does occasionally get big discounts though, so I'd hang out for a sale because I got the Season Pass for less than the price of the Final Transmission. Unfortunately, the Season Pass doesn't include the pre-order and retail specific skins. These are some fucking lazy skins though, so it's not like you're missing out on any premium content. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Final Transmission expansion here, and it should go without saying that this will include spoilers for the main story. I won't spoil the DLC, but if you haven't played the base game yet, please skip to here. So the main story finishes on a huge cliffhanger, and as if this game doesn't have enough critics, they had to go and put the real ending behind a paywall. The Final Transmission picks up directly after the base game's story. Jacob is still on Callisto, having just put Danny in an escape pod when he's contacted by Dr. Mailer saying there's another way off the moon. With Dr. Mailer's help, he must fight his way back through the prison to find a ship and escape Callisto. I thought the story here was pretty interesting. It expands a bit more on the protocol and what was happening at Black Iron, and you get to learn a lot more about Dr. Mailer's involvement. This expansion leans much more heavily into the psychosis theme briefly explored in the main story. Jacob's implant is messing with his head and he starts hearing voices, having visions, and other trippy things start to happen. It's a bit of a clumsy plot device, but it does make things more unsettled and creepy, and I found the DLC to be slightly more scary than the base game. I really love how it ends too, and it's kind of frustrating that this isn't how the main story ends. It's a shame because had this DLC simply been the final chapter, the game might have been received better. From a gameplay point of view, there are a couple of new enemy types, a new minigame thing, and a new weapon. The new weapon is massively overpowered, so the game starts throwing enemies at you in huge numbers, which completely changes how the combat works. I think it's much harder too. The battle before the final boss, for example, is a real doozy. There's a lot of new environments, and the reused areas have been altered to the point where some of them are almost unrecognizable. Overall, there's definitely more variety, and maybe a bit more problem solving than the main game. There still aren't any puzzles, just some of the environments require more exploration to find the path. The hidden areas are less obvious too. Again, nothing mind-blowing, but there was at least one that I thought was quite clever. I wouldn't say that the Final Transmission is essential, but I did enjoy it despite a couple of issues. Can you believe they made the vent sections even more tedious? But if you want more game, more variety, and a much more conclusive ending, then I can recommend it. Oh yeah, and you unlock another shitty skin by beating it. Technical issues aside, I do agree with many of the criticisms. Outside of the combat, the Callisto Protocol doesn't innovate or do much to push the genre forward. It relies heavily on jump scares to be scary, which becomes predictable before long, and the number of vents and sections where you squeeze between something is almost comical by the end. It's not at all original either. This is just a Dead Space game without Isaac and puzzles, and if you need more proof, here are just a few examples. The inventory UI, the crafting stations, the vent sections, the grip, curb stomping bad guys for loot, curb stomping crates for loot, these red explosive canisters, the diegetic UI, the writing on the walls. Even the name of the evil corporation is similar, USG and UJC. With all of that said though, I still don't understand why it was criticised as harshly as it was. It's far from perfect, but it doesn't get enough credit for what it does well. It has incredible atmosphere, for example, and despite the boring jump scares, it's tense. Its world is fascinating with some truly fantastic level design and environmental storytelling. The visuals definitely play a large role in this, and I'd be lying if I said that my enjoyment wasn't partially due to how beautiful this game looks. I think aesthetics are part of the argument that games are art though, and I don't think it's wrong to appreciate a game for its presentation. Yeah, gameplay is king, but moments like this where you're left in awe by what you're seeing can be an important part of the immersion. I felt the same way about the Order 1886, and I think the two games share many similarities in this regard. While the story is a little thin, I don't think it's any thinner than the games that inspired it. The Resident Evil games have thin, poorly acted stories, and the writing, production quality, and performances here are miles better. Yeah, it's derivative and therefore predictable, although I'd argue that the story, which I'm trying hard not to spoil, is kind of a trope of the genre. The Callisto Protocol is also pretty linear, but so was the first Dead Space game, and although an interconnected space would have been cool, the diversity of each environment meant that I always wanted to push forward to see what was next. I truly believe that if the game had launched without the technical issues and with the combat in the state it is today, it would have reviewed far better. People would still be disappointed that Striking Distance wasn't more ambitious, of course. It's not like fixing the issues has suddenly turned it into a flawless must-play, and if you're new to the genre, there are plenty of games I'd recommend over this. The Dead Space remake, for example, is a bigger, scarier, and more satisfying game. That doesn't mean the Callisto Protocol has nothing to offer. The focus on melee combat is unique, and in many ways I like this intimate and claustrophobic approach more than RE4's combat. Its systems and mechanics are not as nuanced as they could be, and the story is just par for the course, but this is not the repetitive snooze fest that plenty of the reviews made it out to be, and based on my experience, performance is in a good place too. If you like these sorts of games and are looking for a solid way to spend 10 hours, you could do a shitload worse.
Oh no.